Turn on the television in America today, and you'll notice something simple and powerful. If you watch Fox News, the country looks a certain way. The problems are framed one way, and the heroes and the villains are clear. The stakes feel obvious. But you switch to CNN or MSNBC, and you're watching the same country, but you're living in a completely different story. Sure, same events, maybe the same facts, but a different reality. There's different heroes, different villains. And it's not persuasion. No one is asking viewers to debate the framing. Each network presents an official story, a coherent explanation of what's happening, why it's happening, and what it means. And once that story is accepted, everything else follows. What feels outrageous, what feels justified, what feels urgent, and what feels dismissible. That's the power of narrative. Not to argue with facts, but to tell you what the facts are supposed to mean. Narrative is one of the most important pillars of power because it defines reality before facts are allowed to matter. Let's talk about it. Hey everybody, welcome to Midweek Sitrep, your bi-weekly briefing on national security and the forces that shape it. My name is Jerry Fowler, and I'm your host. Every other week, I give you the context you need to see what's really going on so you can stay mission-focused. Today, we're talking about the power of narrative. Now, this episode isn't about media bias. It's not about the left or the right or whatever political affiliation you may have. And it's not about whether one network is more honest than the other. It's about narrative, not as opinion, but as power. Narrative is the official story a system tells about reality. It doesn't need to be true. It doesn't need to be false. It just needs to be accepted. This is how power stabilizes itself in modern societies, not through force, but through explanation. Let's get to it. Before we get started, let's talk about what narrative means, because it's one of the most misused words of modern discourse. When most people hear narrative, they think spin. They think messaging, propaganda, something layered on top of the facts to manipulate perception. But that's not the whole story. See, narrative isn't commentary about reality. It's the authorized version of reality itself. It doesn't argue with the facts. It tells you which facts matter and how they're supposed to be understood. Think about it this way. Facts are raw inputs. Events happen, data exists, images are recorded. Narrative is the structure that determines which facts are recognized as relevant, which facts are treated as noise, which facts are elevated, and which facts quietly disappear. If facts are data points, narrative isn't the commentary. It's the operating environment those data points are allowed to exist inside. That's why two people can watch the same footage, read the same headline, and walk away with entirely different understandings, not because one is lying, but because they're operating inside different official stories about what reality is. Narrative doesn't argue with what happened. It defines what is happening. That's why narrative is so powerful politically and strategically. Once an official story is established, decisions stop feeling imposed. They just feel logical, necessary, inevitable. Policy doesn't feel forced. It feels justified. Compliance doesn't feel coerced. It feels required. Conflict doesn't feel tragic. It feels warranted. That's why narrative always comes before strategy, not after. Narrative shapes belief. Belief shapes perception. Perception shapes priorities, and priorities shape policy. Strategy doesn't create belief. It follows the story people already accept. And once that story hardens into common sense, power no longer has to explain itself. Every system of power, whether it's democratic or authoritarian, depends on consent, not enthusiasm, not approval. Consent in this context means something much simpler and much more dangerous. It's acceptance of reality as framed. People don't need to love a system to live inside of it. They just need to believe that it's normal, permanent, or unavoidable. That's why power doesn't begin with force. Force is what power turns to when narrative fails. This is where most analyses get it backward. Empires don't collapse the moment they lose a war. They collapse when their official explanation of the world stops working. Rome didn't fall because it ran out of soldiers. It fell because the story of order, virtue, and civilization no longer matched lived experience. Corruption became visible, decay became undeniable, and loyalty became transactional. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because it lost a single decisive battle. It collapsed when the promise of workers' paradise became visibly false. When scarcity, privilege, and hypocrisy contradicted the story people were expected to accept as reality. In both cases, material conditions mattered, but they weren't decisive on their own. What broke the system was narrative dissonance, the widening gap between the official story and observed reality. Power doesn't fall when challenged. It falls when it stops making sense. This is the insight most people miss. Narratives don't just justify action after the fact. They determine, quietly, in advance, which actions feel possible, reasonable, or even thinkable. Once an official story is accepted, alternatives don't look radical. They look absurd. And once alternatives feel absurd, power no longer has to defend itself. The strongest form of control isn't obedience, it's inevitability. For most of modern history, narrative control was blunt and centralized. Government spoke, media transmitted, citizens received. You might agree or disagree with the message, but you knew when an official story was being delivered. Narrative power was visible, directional, and often clumsy. That model didn't disappear with the internet. It evolved. Platforms didn't eliminate narrative control. They re-engineered how it's delivered. Instead of deciding which message to broadcast, platforms learned something more efficient. If you optimize for engagement, the authorized story no longer needed to be announced. It could be absorbed. TikTok doesn't promote ideology. It promotes reaction. And reaction turns out to be the most reliable signal of emotional alignment ever measured. The system learns what provokes response, what reinforces identity, what stabilizes interpretation. And over time, it stops showing you isolated pieces of information and starts delivering a coherent, explanatory environment, a version of reality calibrated to your responses. That's the critical shift. Propaganda tried to impose a single official story on large populations. Algorithmic systems deliver variations of the same authorized narrative tuned to individual perception. Propaganda announced the story. Algorithms normalized it. This is more powerful than traditional persuasion because it doesn't feel imposed. There's no spokesperson, no declaration, no moment where the story arrives labeled as official. It feels like discovery. It feels like preference. It feels like common sense. And that's why personalization is the most effective narrative system ever built. Because by the time people recognize the story, they've already internalized it as their own understanding of reality. The most effective narratives aren't enforced, they're absorbed. I always get asked the same question. Why TikTok? Why did this one app trigger congressional hearings, executive orders, and years of national security debate, when Americans already use plenty of foreign-made technology? The answer isn't that TikTok is uniquely malicious. And it isn't that the United States suddenly discovered privacy risk. The answer is more uncomfortable than that. TikTok revealed that narrative authority had crossed borders at scale. For the first time, a system capable of participating in the construction of America's everyday reality operated under foreign ownership, foreign legal obligations, and governance structures outside U.S. jurisdiction. That combination matters. This isn't a content problem. It's not about any single video, or trends, or messages. It's an infrastructure problem. The same way ports, undersea cables, or satellite networks are infrastructure. Because recommendation systems don't just distribute information. They help establish what is taken for granted. They influence. They influence which explanations feel authoritative, which interpretations feel reasonable, which claims feel exaggerated, and which stories never gain legitimacy at all. The risk isn't what TikTok shows, it's who gets to participate in defining reality. This is also why lawmakers struggle to explain the threat. Traditional national security risk looks like espionage, stolen documents, hacked systems, intercepted communications. But TikTok doesn't look like that at all. It looks like culture. It looks like entertainment. It looks like creativity and humor and music. And that's precisely the point. Modern narrative power doesn't need to steal secrets. It doesn't need to persuade. It establishes the context in which meaning forms. It doesn't tell people what to think. It helps them determine what counts as normal, credible, or dismissible. From a national security lens, that represents a new category of power, one our legal and policy frameworks weren't designed to identify quickly. That's why the debate has felt confused, emotional, and often incoherent. We've been trying to describe narrative authority using 20th century threat language. This isn't espionage. It's foreign participation in reality setting. And once you see it that way, the response to TikTok stops looking hysterical and starts looking overdue. Watch how TikTok responded when regulation became real. Not with technical disclosures, not with algorithmic transparency, not with narrow legal arguments. It responded by shaping the story. Creators were elevated. Emotional appeals filled feeds. Regulatory scrutiny was reframed, not as oversight, but as cultural suppression. Not through press releases, through the environment itself. And that distinction matters. This wasn't a spontaneous backlash. It was a demonstration of a new kind of corporate power. Platforms now possess the ability to participate directly in defining what regulation is, not as a legal process, but as a moral and cultural act. That's something traditional corporate power never had. In the past, companies fought regulation in courtrooms and committee rooms. They hired lawyers. They hired lobbyists. Today, they can contest the official story itself. Narrative now moves faster than money, and with less accountability. This represents a fundamental shift in power. When corporations succeed in framing regulatory scrutiny as an attack on identity, livelihood, or expression, regulation stops being evaluated on its merits. It becomes a question of legitimacy. And once legitimacy is contested, policymakers aren't just weighing risk. They're managing backlash inside a fractured narrative environment. That's the leverage narrative creates. Corporations no longer defend themselves only in law. They defend themselves inside the information environment where reality is negotiated. In the narrative economy, the most effective defense isn't compliance. It's control over the story regulation is allowed to tell. So what does all of this mean for businesses and compliance? This isn't theoretical. It's already playing out in boardrooms, internal investigations, and enforcement actions. For a long time, compliance was treated primarily as a rules-based exercise. You follow the regulation, you document the process, you check the box, you move on. And that model, it's still there, but it's no longer sufficient on its own. Today, compliance is increasingly evaluated through the lens of judgment. How a company understood its operating environment, identified the risk, and made decisions in light of that understanding. Regulators still care deeply about technical compliance, but they also ask different sets of questions. Kind of like, why was this decision made? How did the company assess the risk at the time? What information was considered and what wasn't? What assumptions shaped the decision-making process? Because enforcement outcomes often turn not on whether a rule was technically violated, but on whether risk was reasonably identified, evaluated, and managed in context. And context matters. That context includes national security priorities, geopolitical conditions, evolving regulatory expectations, and whether governance structures were capable of responding to those realities. Regulators don't just review outcomes, they examine judgment. This is where narrative becomes operational, not as messaging, but as internal understanding. If a company characterizes an activity internally as a routine commercial decision, but the surrounding environment clearly indicates heightened regulatory or national security sensitivity, that disconnect becomes a risk assessment issue, not a communications issue. Because what regulators ultimately evaluate is whether the company's decision-making framework reflected the world as it reasonably existed at the time. Compliance breaks down when risk isn't recognized, not when a rule is imperfectly applied. The organizations that navigate this successfully aren't the ones with the thickest policy binders. They're the ones that can demonstrate thoughtful risk identification, informed decision-making, documented governance, and a clear, reasonable rationale that holds up under scrutiny. Not spin, not hindsight, judgment. That's what modern compliance is being tested on. Here's the part of the conversation that makes people uncomfortable, but matters the most. Human beings don't experience the world as neutral observers. We experience it through patterns that help us function. What we seek isn't objective reality, it's coherent reality, a version of the world that feels understandable and predictable. Narratives provide that coherence. They explain why something happened, who is responsible, what matters, and what response feels appropriate. That doesn't make people irrational, it makes them human. Algorithms don't invent belief out of thin air. They don't implant ideology. What they do is far more subtle and more powerful. They observe what is already resonating, and then they reinforce it. Over time, that reinforcement stabilizes interpretation. Ambiguity disappears. Contradictions fade. Alternative explanations feel increasingly implausible. The algorithm doesn't persuade you, it consolidates you. That's why narrative control rarely feels coercive. There's no pressure, no command, no visible authority. Instead, the system delivers familiarity, a steady stream of content that aligns with how you already understand the world, and that familiarity feels safe. That's the quiet strength of narrative power. It doesn't force compliance, it just reduces friction. And once friction disappears, resistance usually follows. The most effective control doesn't feel like control at all. It feels like reassurance. Now layer artificial intelligence onto everything we've just talked about. Not as science fiction, not as a sudden leap, but as an accelerant. AI doesn't change the nature of narrative power. It changes its precision and its persistence. Instead of broad categories, narrative delivery becomes individualized. Instead of static explanations, reality adjusts in real time. And instead of one official story distributed to millions, there are millions of contextualized versions of the same authorized understanding, each tuned to what stabilizes acceptance. This isn't mass persuasion, it's continuous calibration. Systems learn not just what content performs well, but when attention is most available, which framing reduces friction, which tone feels credible, and which explanations pass without resistance. The future of power isn't broadcasting, it's calibration. What matters here is scale and automation. These systems don't require intent. They don't need ideology. They don't even need a strategic objective beyond optimization. Once narrative delivery is automated and personalized, direction emerges from feedback loops, not from individuals issuing instructions. That's the escalation. Narrative enforcement becomes continuous, context-aware, and increasingly invisible. Not because it's hidden, but because it feels normal. This isn't a warning about what might happen. It's a description of what happens when systems that shape understanding evolve faster than our ability to recognize them as systems. When reality adjusts faster than awareness, control stops looking intentional and starts looking inevitable. Here's the real takeaway, and it's easy to miss because nothing dramatic happens when it takes hold. Narrative power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't issue commands or rely on enforcement. It works by deciding what reality is early enough that alternatives never fully form. That's why narrative isn't a soft concept. It's infrastructure. Whoever shapes the narrative environment determines what feels legitimate, what feels reasonable, and what feels possible. Not through force, but through normalization. Once that environment is set, power no longer needs to argue or persuade. Decisions don't feel imposed. They feel inevitable. And that's the point. Narrative power doesn't tell you what to do. It decides which options exist before you can react. And that's today's Sitrep. Make sure you keep up with Midweek Sitrep on Substack and YouTube for more on this and other topics. You'll find short clips, interviews, and bonus content. And if you want to support the show, check out our merch on everythingisnationalsecurity.com. Every shirt and hat helps keep us independent and growing. I'm Jerry Fowler, and remember, everything is national security. See you next time. Midweek Sitrep with Jerry Fowler is an independent production of OpScent Media Group, LLC. The information provided in this podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute legal, financial, or professional advice. Listeners should consult with a qualified professional before making any decisions based upon the content discussed. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host, Jerry Fowler, and any guest, and do not reflect the official policy, position, or endorsement of any current or former employer, client, government agency, military organization, educational institution, or any other entity for which the host, Jerry Fowler, may be affiliated. Mention of a company, product, or service does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation. Any references are provided for informational purposes only. This podcast does not disclose any classified, proprietary, or confidential information. All discussions are based upon publicly available information and personal expertise.
Everything's national security. OpSent Media Group, LLC.